Thomas Harper stood at his usual post outside Kensington Palace, his polished boots reflecting the morning sun. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, protecting the family with dedication and pride. His uniform was always perfect, his posture military straight, and his commitment unwavering. At 42 years old, Thomas had given his entire adult life to serving the crown. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Tourists gathered behind the barriers, taking photographs and hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. Thomas kept his eyes forward, trained to ignore the cameras and questions. His mind, however, was heavy with thoughts he could not shake. The previous night, he had received devastating news from his doctor. The test came back positive, stage 3 cancer. The words echoed in his mind as he stood guard, trying to maintain his composure. His wife Emma knew nothing yet. He could not find the words to tell her. Their 2 daughters, Sophie and Charlotte, were only 8 and 10 years old. How could he explain that their father might not be there to see them grow up? The medical bills would be enormous. His salary was decent, but not enough to cover the treatments his doctor recommended. Private health care was expensive, and the waiting lists for public treatment were long. Thomas felt his hands trembling slightly inside his white gloves. He clenched them tighter, forcing himself to remain still. A royal guard never shows weakness. That was the first lesson he learned during training. But today that lesson felt impossible to follow. His chest felt tight, and it was not just the ceremonial uniform. Fear gripped him from the inside, spreading through his body like ice water through his veins. Around midday, something unusual happened. Prince George appeared in the courtyard with his security detail. The young prince was only 11 years old, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that reminded Thomas of his own daughters. George was not supposed to be there that day. His schedule usually kept him at school or in private areas of the palace. But there he was, walking slowly through the gardens, his hands in his pockets. Thomas watched from the corner of his eye as protocol demanded. Royal guards were not supposed to make direct eye contact with family members unless addressed. But he could see George moving closer to his post, seemingly lost in thought. The boy stopped near a rose bush, examining the flowers with genuine interest. His security team kept a respectful distance, allowing him some space. Then something extraordinary happened. George turned and looked directly at Thomas. Not just a casual glance, but a steady, searching look. Thomas felt his breath catch. The young prince took several steps forward until he stood just a few feet away. Thomas maintained his position, eyes forward, but his heart pounded in his chest. What was happening? Had he done something wrong? George stood there silently for what felt like an eternity. Thomas could sense the boy's presence, could feel eyes studying him carefully. The tourists behind the barriers started murmuring, cameras clicking rapidly. This was unusual behavior. Princes did not typically approach guards on duty like this. Thomas felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool breeze. The silence stretched on. George did not speak a single word. He simply stood there, his young face serious and thoughtful. Thomas wanted to look down at him, to acknowledge the prince properly, but training held him frozen. Minutes passed. The security team watched carefully but did not intervene. They seemed as puzzled as everyone else about what was happening. Thomas felt something shift inside him during those silent moments. It was as if the young prince could see right through his uniform, through the stoic mask he wore, straight into the pain and fear he was hiding. How could a child sense such things? Yet there George stood, patient and present, saying nothing but communicating everything through his quiet solidarity. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes, George reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small envelope, cream-colored and sealed with a simple clasp. Without a word, he placed it carefully on the stone ledge beside Thomas's post. Then he did something that made Thomas's eyes sting with unexpected tears. The young prince placed his small hand flat against his own heart, held it there for 3 seconds, then gave the slightest nod. Thomas felt his throat tighten. That gesture, so simple yet so profound, carried more weight than any words could convey. George turned and walked back toward the palace entrance, his security team following. He did not look back. The tourists erupted in excited chatter, wondering what they had witnessed. But Thomas stood frozen, staring straight ahead, fighting to keep his composure as tears threatened to break free. The envelope sat on the ledge beside him for the rest of his shift. He could not pick it up while on duty. Rules were rules even in extraordinary circumstances, but he was acutely aware of its presence, of the mystery it contained. What could a young prince possibly have written to a palace guard? Why had he approached in such an unusual way? When his shift finally ended 3 hours later, Thomas was relieved by another guard. His replacement noticed the envelope immediately and raised an eyebrow in question. Thomas said nothing, simply picked up the envelope with hands that shook slightly and tucked it carefully into his uniform pocket. He walked to the guard quarters, his mind racing with possibilities. In the small changing room, Thomas sat on the wooden bench and stared at the envelope. His name was written on the front in careful, neat handwriting. He broke the seal with trembling fingers and pulled out a single sheet of paper. What he read made his vision blur with tears. The letter was brief, but every word felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Thomas read it 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. How could Prince George know? Who had told him? The letter explained everything in simple, compassionate language that no 11-year-old should have to write. But there it was, proof that somehow, impossibly, the young prince understood exactly what Thomas was facing. That night, Thomas drove home in a daze. He pulled into his driveway and sat in his car for 20 minutes, the letter still clutched in his hand. Emma appeared at the front door, worried by his delay. When he finally walked inside, he could not hold back anymore. He collapsed into a chair and told her everything. The diagnosis, the fear, the impossible choice between his duty and his health. Then he showed her the letter. Emma read it silently, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her husband with wonder and confusion. Either of them could understand how this had happened, how a young prince had known what Thomas needed most in his darkest hour. But the evidence was there in black and white, an offer so generous it seemed almost unreal. The next morning arrived with unexpected heaviness. Thomas woke before dawn, his mind refusing to let him sleep. The letter from Prince George sat on his nightstand, a constant reminder of the impossible decision ahead. Emma was already awake beside him, her hand gently holding his. They had talked until midnight, going over every option, every possible outcome. Nothing felt right. Thomas got dressed in his civilian clothes instead of his uniform. He had called in sick for the first time in 5 years. The palace administration expressed surprise but did not question him. Royal guards rarely took sick days. His supervisor assumed it was something minor, perhaps a flu. If only that were true. Emma made breakfast, but neither of them could eat. Their daughters chattered at the table, innocent and unaware of the storm gathering around their family. Sophie talked about her upcoming school play where she would be a tree. Charlotte complained about her mathematics homework. Normal, beautiful problems that felt precious now. Thomas watched them with aching awareness, memorizing every expression, every laugh. After dropping the girls at school, Thomas and Emma drove to the hospital for his consultation appointment. The oncologist was a kind woman named Dr. Patel who explained his treatment options with careful patience. Surgery, followed by aggressive chemotherapy and radiation. The timeline would be 6 to 8 months. The success rate was decent but not guaranteed. The cost, even with insurance, would drain their savings completely. Dr. Patel noticed Thomas's distraction. She asked if he had questions, concerns about the treatment plan. Thomas wanted to ask so many things, but one question dominated all others. Could he continue working during treatment? The doctor hesitated before answering. Probably not, she admitted. The fatigue would be severe. His immune system would be compromised. Standing for long hours in all weather conditions would be dangerous, perhaps impossible. Thomas felt the walls of his carefully built life crumbling. Without his salary, they could not pay their mortgage. Emma worked part-time at a bookshop, but her income covered only groceries and basic bills. His job was not just his pride. It was their lifeline, their security, their future. And now he was being forced to choose between his health and his family's survival. They left the hospital in silence. Emma drove because Thomas could not focus. His mind kept returning to Prince George's letter, to the offer written in that careful young handwriting. It seemed too good to be true, the kind of thing that happened in fairy tales, not real life. Yet the letter was real, solid paper he could hold in his hands. That afternoon, Thomas made the hardest phone call of his life. He contacted the private number listed at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered, her voice professional but warm. She identified herself as Lady Catherine Morrison. a private secretary to the royal family. Yes, she was expecting his call. Yes, the offer in the letter was genuine. Yes, Prince George had insisted on handling this personally. Thomas listened in amazement as Lady Catherine explained the details. The royal family maintained a private fund for staff emergencies. It was rarely discussed publicly, but it had helped numerous employees over the years. Prince George had learned about Thomas's situation through a conversation overheard between security staff. The young prince had immediately gone to his father, Prince William, asking to help. What happened next demonstrated wisdom beyond George's years. Instead of simply donating money, George had researched what Thomas actually needed. He discovered that Thomas required not just medical coverage, but also income replacement and job security. So George had structured his offer carefully. The family would cover all medical expenses privately. Thomas would receive full salary during his treatment. His position would be held for him, guaranteed upon recovery. But there was one condition, and it made Thomas's chest tighten. He had to resign from his post immediately. Not as punishment, Lady Catherine quickly explained, but as protection. If Thomas remained officially employed during treatment, he would lose his medical leave benefits once the private funding became known. Resignation would free him from bureaucratic complications while still receiving support. It seemed backward, but legally it made sense. Thomas struggled with this requirement. His identity was wrapped up in being a royal guard. 12 years of service, of pride, of purpose. Resigning felt like failure, like abandoning his duty. But Emma reminded him of a deeper duty. To their daughters. To his health. To staying alive. Sometimes pride had to bend before practical necessity. He made his decision that evening after tucking his girls into bed. Sophie had asked him why he looked so sad. Thomas told her he was just tired, then held her extra long when she hugged him goodnight. Charlotte showed him her math homework, now completed correctly. He praised her effort and kissed her forehead, breathing in the sweet smell of her shampoo. These moments, he realized, were what mattered most. The next morning, Thomas wore his guard uniform one final time. He reported to his commanding officer and submitted his resignation letter. The officer was shocked and tried to convince him to reconsider. Thomas gave only vague reasons, citing personal health matters. He could not explain the full truth. The agreement with the royal family required discretion. No publicity, no media attention. This was private charity, not public relations. His fellow guards gathered to say goodbye. They had worked together for years, sharing shifts and stories, watching each other's backs. Many were confused by his sudden departure. Thomas shook hands and accepted their well wishes, his heart heavy with things he could not say. They thought he was leaving for some better opportunity. He let them believe it. The hardest part came at the end of his final shift. Thomas stood at his usual post one last time, feeling the familiar weight of his ceremonial rifle, the stiffness of his uniform collar, the pride of service. Tourists took photos as always, not knowing they were capturing a man's last moments in a career that had defined him. He kept his eyes forward, professional to the end, even as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Then, just as his shift was ending, Prince George appeared again. This time he was accompanied by his father, Prince William. They approached Thomas's post together, and for the first time in 12 years, Thomas was permitted to break protocol. His commanding officer had authorized it. Thomas could acknowledge them properly, could speak if spoken to. Prince William extended his hand. Thomas shook it, feeling the firm grip of a future king. William thanked him for his years of service, his dedication, his sacrifice. The words were formal but genuine. Then William stepped aside, making space for his son. Prince George stepped forward, looking small in his school uniform but carrying himself with remarkable composure. George did not offer his hand. Instead, he did something more meaningful. He stood at attention and saluted Thomas. A crisp, proper military salute held for 3 full seconds. It was a gesture of respect from future royalty to a retiring servant. Thomas felt tears burning his eyes. He returned the salute, his hand trembling slightly, his throat too tight for words. No speeches were made. No cameras were allowed. This moment was private, witnessed only by a handful of security personnel and Thomas's commanding officer. George lowered his salute, gave Thomas one of his rare smiles, then turned and walked away with his father. It was over. Thomas's career as a royal guard had ended not with fanfare, but with quiet dignity and unexpected grace. Thomas changed out of his uniform for the last time. He folded it carefully, placed it in his locker, and closed the door. Walking out of Kensington Palace as a civilian felt surreal. The tourists were still there, still taking photos of other guards on duty. Life continued as normal for everyone except him. His transformation was invisible to the outside world but absolute in his heart. That night, Emma held him as he cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of change, of gratitude, of fear about what came next. His treatment would start the following week. The battle ahead would be brutal, but at least now he could fight it without also fighting poverty, without choosing between medicine and mortgage payments, without sacrificing his family's future for his health. Treatment began on a gray Monday morning that matched Thomas's mood perfectly. Emma drove him to the private medical facility arranged by the royal family's fund. The building was modern and clean, nothing like the crowded public hospitals he had expected. The staff knew his name before he introduced himself. Everything had been prepared, scheduled, coordinated. He just had to show up and survive. The first surgery lasted 6 hours. Thomas woke in recovery to find Emma sitting beside his bed, her hand wrapped around his. She had been crying but smiled when his eyes opened. The surgeon came by later to explain that they had removed as much of the tumor as possible. The margins looked good, but cancer was unpredictable. The chemotherapy would start in 2 weeks once he had healed enough from surgery. Those 2 weeks at home were strange and precious. Thomas was weak in pain but surrounded by his family. Sophie and Charlotte had been told a simplified version of the truth. Daddy was sick, but the doctors were helping him get better. The girls made him cards covered in crayon drawings and glitter. They tiptoed around the house, trying to be quiet so he could rest. Their sweetness broke his heart. Emma took leave from her bookshop job to care for him. Money arrived in their account like clockwork, exactly matching his usual palace salary. The arrangement worked seamlessly. Bills were paid. Food appeared on the table. Life continued with an artificial normalcy that Thomas knew was only possible because of extraordinary generosity. Every morning he thought about Prince George, about that wordless moment at his post, and felt gratitude mixed with disbelief. Chemotherapy started with a cocktail of drugs administered through an IV port in his chest. The nurse explained what to expect, but nothing prepared him for the reality. The first session left him exhausted but hopeful. Maybe it would not be so bad. The second session crushed that hope. Nausea hit like a freight train. He could not eat, could barely drink. His body rejected everything. By the third week, Thomas had lost 15 pounds. His hair began falling out in clumps. He shaved his head rather than watch it disappear gradually. Emma cried when she saw him bald, not from revulsion but from the brutal visibility of what he was enduring. He looked like a cancer patient now. There was no hiding it anymore, no pretending things were normal. The girls struggled with their father's transformation. Charlotte became quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped talking about school, stopped complaining about homework. Instead, she spent hours reading silently in her room. Sophie went the opposite direction, becoming clingy and emotional. She had nightmares about Thomas dying and would crawl into their bed at night needing reassurance that he was still breathing. Emma held the family together through sheer force of will. She cooked special meals that Thomas might be able to tolerate. She helped the girls with homework, maintained household routines, and provided emotional support to everyone while dealing with her own terror privately. Thomas watched her strength with awe and guilt. He felt like a burden, useless and weak when his family needed him most. One particularly bad day in his 4th week of treatment, Thomas sat in the bathroom after another bout of vomiting. He was too weak to stand, too discouraged to try. The face in the mirror was unrecognizable, gaunt, pale, with dark circles under sunken eyes. He looked like death warmed over. For the first time, he understood why people gave up on treatment. Living felt harder than dying in that moment. Then his phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unlisted, but the message was clear. It was from Lady Catherine Morrison. "Just checking in. How are you managing? Is there anything you need?" The timing felt almost supernatural. Thomas stared at the message, his eyes filling with tears. Someone was watching over him. Someone cared whether he lived or died beyond just his immediate family. He texted back honestly, "Having a rough day. Treatment is harder than expected." But still fighting. The response came quickly. Prince George asks about you often. He wants you to know that courage is not the absence of fear, but continuing despite it. You are braver than you know. Thomas read those words 3 times, committing them to memory. A young prince thought he was brave. Somehow that mattered more than it should. The text exchange became a regular thing. Not daily but weekly. Lady Catherine would check in. Thomas would update her honestly, and often she would share a message from Prince George. The boy never texted directly, maintaining appropriate boundaries, but his words came through clearly. He was following Thomas's journey, rooting for him, believing in his recovery. It became fuel for Thomas's determination. By week 8, the chemotherapy had ravaged Thomas's body but also seemed to be working. Blood tests showed tumor markers decreasing. Scans revealed shrinking masses. Dr. Patel was cautiously optimistic. The protocol was brutal but effective. Thomas allowed himself to hope again, carefully, like touching something hot that might burn. His fellow guards heard bits and pieces about his illness through the palace grapevine. Several reached out, offering support and encouragement. Thomas was moved by their concern, but could not explain the full extent of help he was receiving. They assumed he was drowning in medical debt, struggling to survive. He let them believe it, bound by his promise of discretion. One guard, Marcus, who had worked beside Thomas for 7 years, showed up at their house with groceries. His wife had sent prepared meals that could be frozen and reheated easily. Marcus stayed for tea, carefully not staring at Thomas's gaunt appearance, talking about everything except cancer. It was exactly what Thomas needed. An hour of normalcy, of friendship, of connection to his former life. The 10th week brought radiation therapy alongside continued chemotherapy. Thomas had to go to the treatment center 5 days a week. The radiation targeted remaining cancer cells with precision that amazed him. Modern medicine was miraculous and torturous in equal measure. Each session lasted only minutes, but the cumulative effect left him burned and exhausted. His skin became dark and sensitive where the beams had focused. Emma started attending a support group for caregivers of cancer patients. She needed an outlet, a place to express her own fear and exhaustion without burdening Thomas. The group met Tuesday evenings at a local community center. Thomas insisted she go, recognizing that she was drowning in silence. She came home from the first meeting with red eyes, but also with a lighter expression. Sharing the burden helped. Charlotte's teacher called to express concern about her withdrawn behavior at school. Thomas and Emma had a family meeting with both girls, trying to explain honestly what was happening. Yes, Daddy was very sick. Yes, it was scary. But the doctors were excellent. The medicine was working, and they had help that most families did not have. They were lucky in their unluckiness. The girls seemed to understand, at least partially. Week 12 marked the halfway point. Thomas celebrated by managing to eat an entire sandwich without vomiting. Small victories meant everything now. His weight had stabilized. Hair began growing back in odd patches. Dr. Patel was pleased with his progress, though she warned that the hardest weeks might still be ahead. The body could only take so much poison before it rebelled completely. That week, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A large envelope with the royal seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from Prince George. Not typed by secretaries, but actually written in the boy's own hand. Thomas read it slowly, treasuring every carefully formed word. George wrote about his own struggles with public attention, with pressure, with expectations. He wrote about learning that true strength was asking for help when you needed it. He wrote that Thomas had taught him something important about service and sacrifice through his years as a guard. The letter ended with a simple statement. Please keep fighting. We are rooting for you. Thomas kept that letter in his bedside drawer. On the worst nights, when pain kept him awake and fear whispered about death, he would take it out and read it by phone light. An 11-year-old prince saw value in his survival. That awareness became a tether holding him to life when his own will faltered. He could not let George down. He could not make that compassionate young boy sad by giving up. By week 14, Thomas could walk around the block without collapsing. His appetite returned slowly. The nausea became manageable with medication. His body was learning to coexist with the treatment, to absorb the punishment without completely breaking down. He started to really believe that he might survive this. The finish line was still distant but no longer invisible. Spring arrived while Thomas fought his private war against cancer. Trees bloomed outside his window, nature indifferent to human suffering but beautiful nonetheless. He watched the seasons change from his living room, tracking time not by calendar dates but by treatment cycles. 16 weeks down. 8 more to go if everything went according to plan. His appearance had changed so dramatically that neighbors barely recognized him. The muscular guard who used to jog every morning had become a thin, shuffling figure who struggled to check the mailbox. People who knew about his illness offered sympathy with awkward kindness. Those who did not know simply stared, then looked away quickly. Thomas learned to ignore both reactions. Emma's mother moved in temporarily to help with the girls. Grandma Rose was a practical woman who asked few questions and simply did what needed doing. She cooked, cleaned, drove the girls to activities, and gave Emma space to focus on Thomas without guilt. Her presence transformed the household from barely functioning to almost normal. Thomas was grateful but also embarrassed. He had always been the provider, the protector. Now he was the problem everyone worked around. Charlotte slowly emerged from her shell with Grandma Rose's patience. The older woman had a gift for drawing children out without pushing. She and Charlotte baked cookies together, worked on craft projects, and talked about everything except cancer. Slowly, Charlotte began smiling again, began sharing stories from school. Her grades improved. She joined the chess club and discovered she was good at strategy. Life continued for her even while Thomas's remained suspended. Sophie attached herself to Thomas despite his illness. She would sit beside him on the couch during his worst days, her small hand holding his, chattering about nothing important. Her company was simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. Thomas did not want his daughter's childhood memories to be dominated by his sickness. But Sophie seemed determined to be present, to witness his struggle, to offer her small support. He learned to accept it with grace. Week 18 brought a setback. Thomas developed an infection that landed him in the hospital for 4 days. His compromised immune system could not fight off even simple bacteria. Antibiotics through IV finally cleared it, but the incident terrified everyone. Emma barely left his hospital room. The girls were kept home from school, Grandma Rose watching them carefully. For several days, the family held its collective breath, afraid this complication might be the beginning of the end. But Thomas rallied. The antibiotics worked. His fever broke. Color returned to his face. Dr. Patel explained that infections were common during chemotherapy but treatable. They would adjust his medication, be more careful about exposure, monitor him more closely. It was a scare, not a death sentence. Thomas was released with strict instructions about hand washing, avoiding crowds, and reporting any symptoms immediately. Lady Catherine checked in frequently during this time. Her messages became more personal, less formal. She shared that Prince George had been genuinely worried when he heard about the infection. The young prince had apparently asked his father several times if Thomas would be okay. William had to reassure his son that medical staff were excellent and doing everything possible. The idea of an 11-year-old prince losing sleep over a former guard's infection was absurd and touching. Week 20 marked a turning point. Thomas's latest scans showed significant improvement. The tumors had shrunk to almost nothing. Blood work was the best it had been since diagnosis. Dr. Patel used the word remission cautiously, explaining it was too early to be certain, but the trajectory was excellent. If he could just get through the remaining 4 weeks of treatment, his prognosis would improve dramatically. Hope is a dangerous thing. Thomas had learned to keep it controlled, to not let it run wild and set him up for crushing disappointment. But hearing remission, even with all the caveats, released something in his chest. He went home that day and cried for 20 minutes while Emma held him. Not tears of sadness this time, but of relief, of possibility, of imagining a future he had stopped letting himself picture. The girls sensed the change in atmosphere. That night at dinner, Thomas was able to eat a full meal for the first time in months. Grandma Rose had made his favorite roast chicken. He managed 3 helpings and actually enjoyed the taste. Sophie clapped her hands in delight. Charlotte smiled her first genuine smile in weeks. Even Emma laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but real. The family felt like a family again instead of a tragedy in progress. Thomas started making plans, small ones at first. Maybe he could attend Sophie's school play next month. Perhaps they could take a day trip to the beach once treatment ended. He wanted to take Emma on a proper date, wanted to feel like a husband instead of a patient. These desires felt revolutionary after months of simply trying to survive each day. Planning meant believing in tomorrow. His former commanding officer called to check on him. Thomas was surprised by the gesture. The palace was usually strict about maintaining professional boundaries, but his CO explained that several guards had been asking about him. They wanted to organize a visit if Thomas felt up to it. The idea terrified and pleased him in equal measure. He was not ready for visitors yet, but knowing they cared enough to ask mattered immensely. Week 22 brought the final chemotherapy session. Thomas sat in the treatment chair, watching the last bag of poison drip into his veins, and felt overwhelming gratitude mixed with exhaustion. He had survived 22 weeks of the most brutal experience of his life. His body was damaged but not broken. His spirit was battered but intact. The finish line was finally visible, close enough to touch. The medical staff threw him a small celebration after that final session. Nothing elaborate, just cupcakes and congratulations. The nurses who had cared for him through his darkest days hugged him gently, mindful of his fragile state. Dr. Patel shook his hand and told him she was proud of him. Patients do not always make it through the protocol. Many give up. Thomas had shown remarkable determination. He thanked her but thought about Prince George's letter, about having someone to fight for beyond himself. Radiation continued for 2 more weeks after chemotherapy ended. Those sessions felt almost easy by comparison. His energy began returning slowly. Food tasted normal again. His hair grew back, though it came in white instead of brown. Emma said it made him look distinguished. Thomas thought it made him look old. But being old meant being alive, so he accepted it without complaint. The last day of radiation was anticlimactic. Thomas simply finished his session, thanked the technicians, and walked out. No ceremony, no fanfare. Emma was waiting in the car. They drove home in silence, both too emotionally exhausted to speak. Treatment was over. Now came the waiting, the monitoring, the hoping that cancer would not return. The battle was won, but the war continued in uncertainty. That evening, Thomas received another text from Lady Catherine. Prince George wanted to know if Thomas would be willing to meet once he felt recovered. Nothing official or public, just a private conversation, a chance for George to see that his support had made a difference. Thomas stared at the message in disbelief. A prince wanted to meet with him. After everything, George still cared enough to follow through personally? Thomas discussed it with Emma. She was concerned about his health, about pushing himself too soon. But she also understood the significance of the request. Prince George had invested emotionally in Thomas's survival. The boy deserved closure, deserved to see the result of his compassion. They agreed Thomas would accept once he felt physically ready, probably in another month or 2. Week 25 post-diagnosis brought Thomas's first follow-up appointment. Dr. Patel examined him thoroughly, ran comprehensive tests, and studied his scans carefully. Then she delivered the words Thomas had been desperate to hear. Complete remission, no detectable cancer remaining. His body had responded to treatment better than anyone dared hope. He would need regular monitoring for years, and recurrence was always possible, but for now he was cancer-free. Thomas walked out of that appointment feeling lighter than air. Emma actually screamed with joy in the parking lot, not caring who heard. They called Grandma Rose from the car. She cried happy tears and promised to make Thomas's favorite dessert. They picked the girls up from school early, something they never did, and took them for ice cream. Sophie and Charlotte knew something wonderful had happened, but could not quite understand the magnitude. Thomas tried to explain that Daddy was better now, really better, and they could stop being scared. That night, Thomas sat in his daughter's room after tucking them in. He watched them sleep, their faces peaceful and innocent, and finally allowed himself to believe he would see them grow up. He would walk Sophie down the aisle someday. He would teach Charlotte to drive. He would meet his grandchildren. Cancer had not stolen his future. Thanks to excellent medicine, his own determination, Emma's support, and the inexplicable kindness of a young prince, he had survived. Recovery was slower and stranger than Thomas expected. His body was cancer-free, but it was also damaged from months of poison and radiation. Simple tasks like climbing stairs left him winded. His muscles had atrophied from months of limited activity. The doctors said full recovery could take 6 months to a year. Thomas was impatient with his weakness, but forced himself to accept the timeline. Physical therapy became his new routine. 3 times a week, he worked with a therapist named Marcus who specialized in cancer recovery. The exercises seemed absurdly simple at first. Lifting soup cans as weights, walking on a treadmill at barely more than a crawl, stretching muscles that had forgotten how to flex properly. Thomas felt embarrassed by his limitations, but Marcus was patient and encouraging. Every small improvement was celebrated as a victory. Emma returned to her bookshop job, though only part-time at first. They needed her income now more than ever. The palace payments had stopped once treatment ended exactly as agreed. Thomas did not begrudge this. The family had already received more help than most people could dream of. But the sudden return to financial reality was jarring. Bills piled up. Savings were depleted. They had survived cancer but were now facing potential bankruptcy. Thomas started looking for work despite his weakened condition. But who would hire a cancer survivor still in recovery? He could not return to palace guard duty. The physical requirements were beyond him, perhaps permanently. His other skills were limited. Security work required stamina he did not have. He was 43 years old with no college education and a huge gap in his employment history. The job market looked bleak. Grandma Rose had returned to her own home, but she visited frequently. She noticed Thomas's growing depression as rejection letters accumulated. One afternoon, she sat him down for a frank conversation. He had faced cancer and won. Finding work was a smaller battle, but it required the same determination. He could not give up just because the path was unclear. Her tough love cut through his self-pity and reminded him who he was. A fighter, a survivor. Sophie's school play arrived as promised. She played a sunflower in a garden-themed production. Thomas sat in the audience beside Emma and Charlotte, his eyes damp with emotion throughout the performance. 6 months ago, he had not been certain he would live to see this moment. Now here he was, watching his daughter beam under stage lights, singing off-key but with complete confidence. Life had given him a second chance, and he felt the weight of that gift in every heartbeat. After the play, Sophie ran to him with her costume still on, her face painted yellow. She threw herself into his arms with the force she used before he got sick. Thomas caught her, stumbling slightly but holding tight. She smelled like face paint and childhood joy. He buried his face in her hair and whispered that she was the best sunflower he had ever seen. Sophie giggled and said he had to say that because he was her dad. But his pride was genuine, earned through nearly losing the chance to witness moments like these. 2 weeks after Sophie's play, Thomas received the call he had been anticipating with mixed emotions. Lady Catherine Morrison asked if he felt ready to meet Prince George. The young prince would be visiting a private royal residence in the countryside the following weekend. If Thomas was willing and able, arrangements could be made for a brief visit. Nothing formal, nothing recorded, just a conversation between two people whose lives had intersected in an extraordinary way. Thomas agreed immediately, then spent the next week terrified. What did one say to a prince who had saved his life? How did he adequately express gratitude for a gift so immense? Emma helped him practice, though they both knew no rehearsal could prepare him for the reality. She insisted he wear his best suit, the one he had worn to their wedding. It still fit, though loosely. His weight had not fully returned. The drive to the countryside estate took 2 hours. Emma came with him for support, leaving the girls with Grandma Rose. They barely spoke during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts. The landscape changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills and ancient trees. The estate appeared suddenly, a beautiful stone manor surrounded by manicured gardens. Security waved them through the gates after checking their identification. Lady Catherine met them at the entrance. She was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an efficient manner. She explained the protocol briefly. Prince George would meet Thomas in the library. The conversation would be private. Emma would wait in a sitting room with tea and biscuits. There was no time limit, no agenda. George simply wanted to talk. Thomas followed Lady Catherine through hallways lined with paintings and history. His heart pounded so hard he wondered if she could hear it. They reached a door and she knocked gently before opening it. The library was magnificent, filled with books from floor to ceiling, sunlight streaming through tall windows. And there, standing beside a leather chair, was Prince George. The young prince was taller than Thomas remembered, though still clearly a child. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater, looking nothing like the formal figure from royal photographs. George smiled nervously when Thomas entered. Lady Catherine withdrew, closing the door behind her, leaving them alone. For a moment neither spoke. Thomas felt frozen, unsure how to begin. George broke the silence first. He asked Thomas to please sit, gesturing to a comfortable chair. His voice was still young but carried quiet authority. Thomas sat gratefully, his legs unsteady. George sat across from him, his posture formal despite his casual clothing. Then he did something that shocked Thomas. He apologized. The prince said he hoped his involvement had not been intrusive or unwelcome. He knew it was unusual for royalty to interfere in staff matters. But when he overheard security personnel discussing Thomas's situation, he could not ignore it. His parents had taught him that privilege came with responsibility. Having resources meant nothing if you did not use them to help others when possible. He hoped Thomas did not feel uncomfortable with the arrangement. Thomas found his voice finally. He told George there was nothing to apologize for. The prince had saved his life, had saved his family. There were no words adequate to express his gratitude. He tried anyway, his voice breaking several times. He explained what those months of treatment had been like, how the fear of leaving his daughters fatherless had been worse than the physical pain. Knowing he had support, knowing someone cared about his survival had given him strength on the darkest days. George listened intently, his young face serious. When Thomas finished, the prince asked about his daughters. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed pictures. Sophie in her sunflower costume, Charlotte with her chess trophy. George studied each photo carefully, asking questions about their interests, their personalities. His genuine interest was evident. This was not polite small talk. He truly cared about these strangers who had been impacted by his decision to help. The conversation shifted naturally. George talked about the pressure of his position, about knowing his entire life was already planned. He would be king someday, whether he wanted it or not. Sometimes he felt like a palace guard himself, standing at attention while life passed by. Thomas saw the vulnerability beneath the royal exterior. This boy carried burdens no child should have to bear, yet he had taken time from his own concerns to help a guard he barely knew. Thomas asked the question that had haunted him since that day at his post. How had George known? The prince smiled slightly and explained. He had been walking through the palace that morning, distracted by his own thoughts. He noticed Thomas at his usual post, but something seemed different. The guard's hands were shaking inside his gloves. His jaw was clenched too tight. His eyes, though forward-facing, held a desperate sadness. George said he had learned to read people by necessity. Royal life meant constant observation, constant assessment of who was genuine and who was not. He could see Thomas was suffering in a way that went beyond physical discomfort. Later that day, he mentioned it to his security detail. They explained perhaps more than they should have about Thomas's recent diagnosis and the impossible choice he faced. George immediately knew he had to help. But why approach Thomas directly? Why not just arrange the funding quietly through administrators? George's answer was simple but profound. Because Thomas deserved to know he was seen, that his struggle mattered to someone beyond his immediate family. Anonymous charity was useful but impersonal. George wanted Thomas to understand that a real person, not just an institution, cared about his survival. The wordless moment at the post was George's way of communicating what he could not say aloud with cameras and tourists watching. Thomas felt tears running down his face. He made no effort to hide them. This child prince had understood something essential about human dignity that many adults never grasped. Being helped was hard. Being seen while being helped made it bearable. George had given him not just money but acknowledgement, respect, solidarity. That gift was somehow even more valuable than the financial support. They talked for over an hour. George asked about Thomas's recovery, his plans for the future. Thomas admitted he was struggling to find work, uncertain what came next. George listened thoughtfully, then said something that surprised Thomas again. He asked if Thomas had ever considered teaching. His experience as a royal guard, his understanding of duty and sacrifice, his recent journey through illness and recovery, all of this was valuable knowledge that could benefit others. The prince explained that there were programs for veterans and former service members transitioning to civilian careers. Teaching positions in security training, consulting work for protection services, even speaking engagements about resilience and overcoming adversity. Thomas had more to offer than he realized. He just needed to see his experience as an asset rather than a limitation. George promised to have Lady Catherine send information about several programs that might interest him. As their meeting drew to a close, Thomas felt he had to ask one more question. Why did George care so much? He was just a guard, one of hundreds who had served the family over the years. What made his situation special enough to warrant such extraordinary intervention? George's answer was immediate and honest. Because he could help. Because Thomas had served his family faithfully for 12 years. Because doing nothing when you had the power to help was a betrayal of everything his parents had taught him about responsibility and compassion. Autumn arrived exactly 1 year after Thomas's cancer diagnosis. He marked the anniversary quietly without fanfare. Emma made his favorite dinner. The girls drew cards decorated with hearts and rainbows. Grandma Rose called to remind him how proud she was of his strength. It was a day of reflection more than celebration. Thomas thought about who he had been a year ago and who he had become. Cancer had taken much, but it had also given unexpected gifts. Perspective, gratitude, understanding of what truly mattered. His teaching career was flourishing in ways he had not anticipated. Colonel Barrett promoted him to senior instructor, making his position permanent with better salary and benefits. Thomas now led multiple classes each week, taught specialized weekend workshops, and mentored newer instructors. The work challenged him intellectually in ways palace guard duty never had. Every day brought new problems to solve, new students to inspire, new lessons to refine. One of his students, a young veteran named Marcus, reminded Thomas of himself at that age. Serious, dedicated, but carrying invisible wounds from his service. Marcus struggled with anxiety that interfered with his training performance. Thomas recognized the signs and pulled him aside after class one day. They talked for an hour about mental health, about seeking help, about strength being vulnerability rather than perfection. Marcus opened up about his experiences, his fears. Thomas shared his own cancer journey, his moments of weakness and despair. The conversation changed something in Marcus. He sought counseling and began improving dramatically. Stories like Marcus's reminded Thomas why his new career mattered. He was not just teaching security protocols. He was helping people rebuild their lives after trauma, transition from military to civilian identity, and find purpose after loss. His own suffering had equipped him to understand theirs. Every difficult moment of his cancer battle became useful, transformed from pure pain into meaningful experience he could share to help others. The security training program gained a reputation for excellence. Companies began requesting graduates specifically from their facility. Colonel Barrett credited much of the success to the quality of instruction, singling out Thomas's contributions in staff meetings. Thomas felt pride he had not experienced since his palace guard days. He was building something valuable, creating legacy beyond simply standing at a post. His work mattered in tangible, measurable ways. Sophie turned 9 that autumn with a birthday party full of friends and laughter. Thomas watched her blow out candles and make a wish, her face glowing with childhood joy. A year ago, he had feared missing this moment. Now he was fully present, healthy enough to set up party games and clean up afterward. The mundane gift of being there, of participating in ordinary family life, felt extraordinary to someone who had nearly lost it. Charlotte was thriving in her chess club, winning local tournaments and gaining confidence. She was still quiet, still serious, but no longer withdrawn. The shadow of her father's illness had lifted, allowing her personality to emerge fully. She talked about maybe becoming a doctor someday, wanting to help people the way doctors had helped her dad. Thomas encouraged the dream while gently reminding her she had years to decide. But he was moved that his struggle had inspired her toward service rather than bitterness. Emma blossomed as well. With financial pressure easing and Thomas's health stable, she returned to her full-time bookshop position. She had always loved her work but had treated it as just a job while Thomas's career was the priority. Now she pursued management training and began planning to open her own bookshop someday. Thomas supported her ambitions fully, recognizing that cancer had taught them both that life was too short to postpone dreams. They had to build the future they wanted while they still had time. The text exchanges with Prince George continued sporadically but meaningfully. George shared news about starting at a new school, about the pressures of public life, about missing normalcy. Thomas offered perspective as someone who had observed royal life from the outside. He assured George that the service he would provide as king someday mattered immensely. The compassion George had shown to a struggling guard was proof he had the heart required for true leadership. George asked questions about Thomas's teaching, seeming genuinely interested in how people learned and grew. The prince was clearly thinking about his own future role, about how to serve effectively rather than just ceremonially. Thomas was honored to contribute, in his small way, to shaping the perspective of someone who might rule the nation someday. Their unlikely friendship, born from crisis and kindness, had evolved into something mutually beneficial. George learned about real-world challenges. Thomas gained insight into the burdens of privilege and duty. Winter came with the kind of cold that reminded Thomas of standing guard at the palace. He felt occasional nostalgia for those days, for the simplicity of that life. But he did not regret leaving. That chapter had closed to make room for something richer, more complex, more personally fulfilling. He was no longer just following orders. He was creating value through his own judgment and skills. The shift from serving to leading had transformed his sense of identity. His one-year cancer-free anniversary arrived in January. Dr. Patel conducted thorough scans and blood work. Everything came back clean. No signs of cancer anywhere. The doctor smiled broadly when delivering the news, reminding Thomas that each clean scan reduced his recurrence risk significantly. If he made it to 5 years cancer-free, his prognosis would be excellent. Thomas left the appointment walking on air, texting Emma immediately. She responded with a string of celebration emojis, her joy evident even through digital communication. That evening, Thomas took his family out for a nice dinner, something they had not been able to afford in over a year. They went to an Italian restaurant the girls loved, ordered too much food, and laughed until their sides hurt. Sophie spilled soda on Charlotte's shirt, sparking a minor argument that Emma diffused with practiced ease. It was beautifully, perfectly normal. Thomas soaked in every moment, engraving it in his memory alongside the harder times. Joy meant more when you understood how easily it could disappear. The training facility received a significant contract that spring to provide security for a major international event. Colonel Barrett asked Thomas to help lead the preparation program. It was high-pressure work with tight deadlines, but Thomas thrived under the challenge. He designed specialized training modules, ran intensive practice scenarios, and personally coached the selected security team. When the event concluded without any incidents, their facility received industry recognition. Thomas's name was specifically mentioned in the commendation letter. Emma's bookshop finally promoted her to assistant manager that spring. She came home with the news practically glowing, talking about increased responsibility and a real salary increase. Thomas hugged her fiercely, proud of her accomplishment and grateful they could both celebrate professional success. Their family had endured so much darkness. Watching light return to their lives felt like witnessing a miracle in slow motion. Recovery was not just physical. It was emotional, financial, relational, spiritual. Sophie's teacher called to say she had been selected for the gifted program at school. Charlotte won her regional chess championship. Grandma Rose announced she was dating someone, a widower from her book club. Small victories accumulated, building momentum toward a future that looked bright instead of bleak. Thomas sometimes had to remind himself this was really his life now, not just a dream he would wake from. But it was real. They had survived. They were thriving. Summer marked 18 months since Thomas's last treatment. He felt completely normal now, his body fully recovered from the chemical assault it had endured. His hair was permanently white, giving him a mature appearance that suited his teaching role. Students called him Professor Harper even though he had no formal degree. The title amused and pleased him. He had become something he never imagined possible. An educator, a mentor, a leader in his field. Lady Catherine reached out with an unusual request. Prince George was preparing a speech about Sarah. Autumn arrived exactly 1 year after Thomas's cancer diagnosis. He marked the anniversary quietly, without fanfare. Emma made his favorite dinner. The girls drew cards decorated with hearts and rainbows. Grandma Rose called to remind him how proud she was of his strength. It was a day of reflection more than celebration. Thomas thought about who he had been a year ago and who he had become. Cancer had taken much, but it had also given unexpected gifts: perspective, gratitude, understanding of what truly mattered. His teaching career was flourishing in ways he had not anticipated. Colonel Barrett promoted him to senior instructor, making his position permanent with better salary and benefits. Thomas now led multiple classes each week, taught specialized weekend workshops and mentored newer instructors. The work challenged him intellectually in ways palace guard duty never had. Every day brought new problems to solve, new students to inspire, new lessons to refine. One of his students, a young veteran named Marcus, reminded Thomas of himself at that age. Serious, dedicated, but carrying invisible wounds from his service. Marcus struggled with anxiety that interfered with his training performance. Thomas recognized the signs and pulled him aside after class one day. They talked for an hour about mental health, about seeking help, about strength being vulnerability rather than perfection. Marcus opened up about his experiences, his fears. Thomas shared his own cancer journey, his moments of weakness and despair. The conversation changed something in Marcus. He sought counseling and began improving dramatically. Stories like Marcus's reminded Thomas why his new career mattered. He was not just teaching security protocols. He was helping people rebuild their lives after trauma, transition from military to civilian identity, and find purpose after loss. His own suffering had equipped him to understand theirs. Every difficult moment of his cancer battle became useful, transformed from pure pain into meaningful experience he could share to help others. The security training program gained a reputation for excellence. Companies began requesting graduates specifically from their facility. Colonel Barrett credited much of the success to the quality of instruction, singling out Thomas's contributions in staff meetings. Thomas felt pride he had not experienced since his palace guard days. He was building something valuable, creating legacy beyond simply standing at a post. His work mattered in tangible, measurable ways. Sophie turned 9 that autumn with a birthday party full of friends and laughter. Thomas watched her blow out candles and make a wish, her face glowing with childhood joy. A year ago, he had feared missing this moment. Now he was fully present, healthy enough to set up party games and clean up afterward. The mundane gift of being there, of participating in ordinary family life, felt extraordinary to someone who had nearly lost it. Charlotte was thriving in her chess club, winning local tournaments and gaining confidence. She was still quiet, still serious, but no longer withdrawn. The shadow of her father's illness had lifted, allowing her personality to emerge fully. She talked about maybe becoming a doctor someday, wanting to help people the way doctors had helped her dad. Thomas encouraged the dream while gently reminding her she had years to decide. But he was moved that his struggle had inspired her towards service rather than bitterness. Emma blossomed as well. With financial pressure easing and Thomas's health stable, she returned to her full-time bookshop position. She had always loved her work, but had treated it as just a job while Thomas's career was the priority. Now she pursued management training and began planning to open her own bookshop someday. Thomas supported her ambitions fully, recognizing that cancer had taught them both that life was too short to postpone dreams. They had to build the future they wanted while they still had time. The text exchanges with Prince George continued sporadically but meaningfully. George shared news about starting at a new school, about the pressures of public life, about missing normalcy. Thomas offered perspective as someone who had observed royal life from the outside. He assured George that the service he would provide as king someday mattered immensely. The compassion George had shown to a struggling guard was proof he had the heart required for true leadership. George asked questions about Thomas's teaching, seeming genuinely interested in how people learned and grew. The prince was clearly thinking about his own future role, about how to serve effectively rather than just ceremonially. Thomas was honored to contribute, in his small way, to shaping the perspective of someone who might rule the nation someday. Their unlikely friendship, born from crisis and kindness, had evolved into something mutually beneficial. George learned about real-world challenges. Thomas gained insight into the burdens of privilege and duty. Winter came with the kind of cold that reminded Thomas of standing guard at the palace. He felt occasional nostalgia for those days, for the simplicity of that life. But he did not regret leaving. That chapter had closed to make room for something richer, more complex, more personally fulfilling. He was no longer just following orders. He was creating value through his own judgment and skills. The shift from serving to leading had transformed his sense of identity. His 1-year cancer-free anniversary arrived in January. Dr. Patel conducted thorough scans and blood work. Everything came back clean. No signs of cancer anywhere. The doctor smiled broadly when delivering the news, reminding Thomas that each clean scan reduced his recurrence risk significantly. If he made it to 5 years cancer-free, his prognosis would be excellent. Thomas left the appointment walking on air, texting Emma immediately. She responded with a string of celebration emojis, her joy evident even through digital communication. That evening, Thomas took his family out for a nice dinner, something they had not been able to afford in over a year. They went to an Italian restaurant the girls loved, ordered too much food, and laughed until their sides hurt. Sophie spilled soda on Charlotte's shirt, sparking a minor argument that Emma diffused with practiced ease. It was beautifully, perfectly normal. Thomas soaked in every moment, engraving it in his memory alongside the harder times. Joy meant more when you understood how easily it could disappear. The training facility received a significant contract that spring to provide security for a major international event. Colonel Barrett asked Thomas to help lead the preparation program. It was high-pressure work with tight deadlines, but Thomas thrived under the challenge. He designed specialized training modules, ran intensive practice scenarios, and personally coached the selected security team. When the event concluded without any incidents, their facility received industry recognition. Thomas's name was specifically mentioned in the commendation letter. Emma's bookshop finally promoted her to assistant manager that spring. She came home with the news practically glowing, talking about increased responsibility and a real salary increase. Thomas hugged her fiercely, proud of her accomplishment and grateful they could both celebrate professional success. Their family had endured so much darkness. Watching light return to their lives felt like witnessing a miracle in slow motion. Recovery was not just physical. It was emotional, financial, relational, spiritual. Sophie's teacher called to say she had been selected for the gifted program at school. Charlotte won her regional chess championship. Grandma Rose announced she was dating someone, a widower from her book club. Small victories accumulated, building momentum toward a future that looked bright instead of bleak. Thomas sometimes had to remind himself this was really his life now. Not just a dream he would wake from, but it was real. They had survived. They were thriving. Summer marked 18 months since Thomas's last treatment. He felt completely normal now, his body fully recovered from the chemical assault it had endured. His hair was permanently white, giving him a mature appearance that suited his teaching role. Students called him Professor Harper even though he had no formal degree. The title amused and pleased him. He had become something he never imagined possible. An educator, a mentor, a leader in his field. Lady Catherine reached out with an unusual request. Prince George was preparing a speech about service and compassion for a youth leadership conference. He wondered if Thomas would be willing to let his story be shared anonymously as an example. No names would be used, no identifying details. Just the basic narrative of a person facing crisis who received unexpected help from someone with resources to assist. The speech would emphasize that true nobility meant using privilege to serve others, rather than just enjoying it selfishly. Thomas agreed without hesitation. If his experience could teach others about compassion and responsibility, he wanted it shared. George sent him the draft speech to review. Reading his own story in the prince's words was surreal and moving. George had captured the emotional reality beautifully while protecting Thomas's privacy completely. The speech concluded with a challenge to young people. If you have resources, use them to help. If you see suffering, do not look away. Small acts of kindness can save lives in ways you might never fully understand. The speech was delivered at the conference and received significant media attention. Several news outlets picked up the story, speculating about who the anonymous person helped by royalty might be. Thomas read the coverage with amusement, pleased that no one connected it to him. His former guard colleagues might suspect, but none would violate his privacy by speaking publicly. The story achieved its purpose without exposing Thomas to unwanted attention. George's wisdom in structuring it that way impressed Thomas deeply. That autumn, Thomas was invited to speak at a cancer survivor conference. The organizers had heard about his successful return to work and wanted him to share his experience. He was terrified of public speaking beyond his classroom but felt obligated to accept. He spent weeks preparing, writing, and rewriting his remarks. Emma helped him practice, offering gentle criticism, until his presentation felt natural rather than rehearsed. The conference audience was several hundred people. all cancer survivors or family members of survivors. Thomas stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected his own journey. He talked about diagnosis, treatment, fear, and recovery. He talked about the importance of support systems, both expected and unexpected. He could not name Prince George, but he spoke about how compassion from an unlikely source had given him strength to continue fighting when he wanted to give up. The standing ovation at the end surprised him. People approached afterward to thank him for his honesty, for giving them hope. Several said his story reminded them why they kept fighting their own battles. Thomas realized his suffering had gained purpose beyond just his personal growth. By sharing openly, he was helping others feel less alone. That realization transformed lingering bitterness about what he had endured into gratitude for what he could now offer others. 2 years after his diagnosis, Thomas's life was unrecognizable in the best way possible. He was healthy, professionally successful, financially stable, and deeply connected to his family. The cancer experience had stripped away everything superficial, leaving only what truly mattered: love, purpose, connection, compassion. He had learned that strength was not avoiding weakness, but surviving it with grace. That leadership was not about authority, but about service. That nobility had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with character. Prince George turned 13 that year and sent Thomas a brief message. He thanked Thomas for letting his story be shared and for staying in contact over the years. George said Thomas had taught him as much as any tutor or advisor. Real people facing real challenges provided the best education about what leadership actually required. He promised to remember those lessons when he eventually became king. Thomas read the message several times, moved beyond words that a future monarch valued his perspective. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in late autumn, Thomas sat in his backyard watching his daughters play. Sophie was teaching Charlotte a dance routine, both of them laughing at their mistakes. Emma sat beside him reading a book, her hand resting comfortably on his knee. The moment was simple, ordinary, perfect. Thomas thought about the journey that brought him here. The pain, the fear, the unexpected kindness, the slow recovery, the new purpose. He thought about standing at that palace post 2 years ago, hands trembling inside his gloves, facing an impossible future. He thought about Prince George approaching in silence, communicating through presence what words could never convey. That wordless action, that choice to help rather than look away, had set everything in motion. One person's compassion had saved a life, healed a family, inspired a career, and taught lessons that would echo forward through years. Thomas understood finally what Prince George had truly given him. Not just money or support, though both were essential. George had given him dignity in his darkest hour. He had seen Thomas, truly seen him, when Thomas felt most invisible. That gift of recognition, of mattering to someone beyond his immediate circle, had been the real miracle. Everything else had followed from that moment of simple human connection. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. Sophie and Charlotte called for Thomas to join their dance. He stood and walked toward his daughters, his wife's laughter following him. Life had taught him brutal lessons, but it had also revealed extraordinary beauty. He had survived cancer. He had discovered new purpose. He had witnessed the power of compassion to transform reality. And every single day forward was a gift he would never take for granted again.